Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. Good morning to you. You're now tuned to Future Sense here with myself, Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick. How are you this morning?
I'm very good. I'm fine. It's lovely to come out at this time for our show, and it's actually morning when we get up.
That's right. Good. Daylight saving finished yesterday.
Kind of enjoyed that. Yeah. Indeed.
And we're back in sync with the sunrise again, which is lovely.
Back in sync with the sunrise. Talking about the weather. The weather for today, sunny, and looks beautiful out there. Sunny areas of fog inland this morning. That's already passed. Light winds and daytime maximum temperatures around 30 degrees for Byron 27, Lismore 31, Grafton 33, Ballina 29, and Tweed Heads 28 degrees today. And for tomorrow, mostly sunny. A little bit of rain coming in on Wednesday and Thursday, which is good to have, but it's very beautiful out there this morning. Now, we've got a pretty interesting show today. We're going to be talking in about 20 minutes or so to Michael Garfield from Santa Fe. Oh, he's in Santa Fe.
He's in Santa Fe, yeah. Friend and fellow futurist.
Fellow futurist.
Who's well read on integral theory and spiral dynamics, and he speaks our language.
He's also a paleontologist, and his day job is communications strategist for the Santa Fe Institute, which is the world's preeminent complex systems science research organisation.
Very interesting. Yeah, last time I caught up with Michael was in Austin, Texas, when he was living there, and he just moved not long ago, actually, to Santa Fe to take up that new position.
He's also host and producer of a podcast himself called Future Fossils. I guess that refers to his paleontology.
Yeah.
And has written, continues by night. He writes the speculative non-fiction essay series How to Live in the Future, about human technology, coevolution, and the future of the biosphere and other stuff too. Pretty interesting dude indeed.
Yeah, interesting. The interesting paleontology which led to thinking about the future. Hey.
Yes, and talking about paleontology just quickly too, I thought maybe it's appropriate. You might have seen the ABC news report about researchers uncovering the 66 million year old fish fossils from the day that the dinosaurs died. We might get his view on that too, but I think this is a fascinating little piece out the other day, because it's saying that they have now been able to take literally a fossilized snapshot of the very day, nearly 66 million years ago, when an asteroid smacked into the Earth, fire rained from the sky, and the ground shook far worse than any modern earthquake. How can they do that? That's extraordinary.
Well, I think the point they're making is that it happened in one day. Like in one day, the entire Earth was transformed from this massive collision and the heat and the waves and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and it's kind of important that we see that these things do actually happen on this planet.
It is important, and it made me think of the Younger Dryas event, which supposedly happened roughly about 12,000 years ago, where something very, very similar occurred. A meteor smacked into the Earth and created floods and tidal waves, and most likely gave rise to the famous flood stories, which come from all cultures.
The Ark.
Indeed.
The Ark of the Covenant. Oh, not the Ark. The Ark. The other Ark. One of those Arks. Let's start with some music now. So we've been talking to Michael Garfield. We've got some other important things too. We're going to talk a little bit about 5G, the fifth generation.
We've been waiting to hear about trials, and
Yes.
and there's some recent news about a trial that they tried to do in Brussels, which was rejected.
Absolutely. And the first picture of the first black hole supposedly is going to be released in a couple of days. We might mention that and talk a little bit about that, and a little bit about the possibility of a hyper crash. We're always talking about the fragility of the current system. That's, I guess, one of the reasons we're sitting in these chairs to really talk about just that. You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. Yes, it's 9:23 here, and very shortly we'll be talking to Michael Garfield from America, from the US. He's a paleontologist and a futurist and much more. A couple of small things. We've just been alerted to a vegan protest going on in Melbourne CBD at the moment. Interesting. What can we know about this? 3AW Breakfast is reporting from down there.
Yeah, don't know much. Just saw some tweets Ross Hill sent through to us.
G'day, Ross.
Thanks, Ross. And what I thought was interesting from the photo that I saw was the way that they're protesting. Instead of being in a large sort of concentrated group like most protests, they are spread out across the road or down the road, blocking the road with what look like 20 or 30 metres between each individual holding a sign, which of course makes it much harder for law enforcement to control them if they're spread out over a large distance.
Is this an example of the wisdom of crowds?
Well, it could be. Yeah. I think it's quite an intelligent way to bring traffic to a standstill and remain less vulnerable to action by
others. True. And there's also some other demonstrations apparently at abattoirs around the country. It's a strong thing, veganism, and I certainly support the idea that we shouldn't be eating as many animals as we do. And veganism, of course, means you don't eat any animals, including even the honey from the bee, which I personally can't get on board with, but I certainly agree that we do need on the planet probably to eat less meat. But the almost militaristic style, I hesitate to use that word, of vegan activists is a strong response, isn't it? And how would we configure that in terms of that?
Look, from a developmental psychology point of view, you're talking about conformism. So there's a shared belief and a feeling, within a group that everybody needs to conform to that belief, and in this case, a feeling that everybody outside the group also needs to conform to the belief. And it just depends, it's kind of like a spectrum as to how strongly that belief is held and impressed upon others. But it's the kind of these conformist worldviews, of course, belong in the community side of the evolutionary spiral. So we're talking about the even-numbered systems in Claire Graves' model, which have been tribalism and authoritarianism, and now the emerging relativism.
Yes.
And so you really need to talk to the individuals involved to get a true analysis of which one of those systems is really driving the behaviour. But we know, for example, that the fourth system, the absolutistic way of being human, has a tendency or can be taken to an extreme, and then it turns into a type of fundamentalism, which we've seen behind a lot of conflict in the world throughout history. And in this case, the conformist belief is being expressed in a very peaceful way. So that suggests it's more likely to come from the emerging relativistic, postmodern, network-centric.
We should actually, before we talk to Michael Garfield, we're going to give a brief sketch about Claire W. Graves' work in terms of those layers, because we're going to probably be talking from that place a little bit.
Michael, I think, is used to using the coloured code from the Spiral Dynamics book.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to really briefly explain that the modern scientific industrial paradigm, which we're moving out of at the moment, is coded orange in Spiral Dynamics. So you might hear us talking about orange. We're talking about the old paradigm.
Yeah. In
that case, going back another paradigm to the absolutistic, authoritarian, agricultural era or paradigm, that's coded blue. So blue to orange, modern scientific industrial, and then green is the emerging, some call it postmodern, some people I think might even be calling it postmodern, but relativistic, human values centred, network centric. And then we have the big leap into second tier, and the first layer in second tier is coded yellow, and then turquoise is the second layer in second tier. So from the authoritarian blue to the modern orange to the relativistic green, and then into second tier yellow.
Which is essentially where most people on the planet are in one of those four layers.
Across that spectrum. Yeah.
We've got a text in just about the vegan protest down there in Melbourne. A listener's texted in, thank you for that. The protests have been organised to mark the 1-year anniversary of the release of the documentary Dominion, which looks into practices employed daily on Australian livestock farms. It's an Australian-wide movement today, so there you go.
Yeah.
Good purpose for that.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense, here on Bay FM. Yes, it's 9:34 here on Bay FM on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and myself, Nick Jeans. And it's a great pleasure to welcome our guest this morning all the way from Santa Fe. Well, he's actually in Santa Fe in New Mexico in the United States. Poet, philosopher, paleontologist, futurist Michael Garfield, who seeks to restore soul to futurism like that and midwifing new myths that can cultivate the curiosity and play we'll need to thrive in our accelerating age. He's also the host and producer of Future Fossils podcast, devoted to the integration of art, science and philosophy, a transdisciplinary approach to our age of planetary crisis and renaissance. And in the daytime, he works as a communications strategist for the Santa Fe Institute, the world's preeminent complex systems science research organization. And by night, he writes the speculative non-fiction essay series, How to Live in the Future, about human technology, coevolution and the future of the biosphere. So pretty interesting chap, and a great pleasure to welcome Michael Garfield to Bay FM here in Byron Bay. Good day, Michael. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. There's an introduction for you.
Good to have you.
Thanks.
Good to have you on the show, mate. It's been a while since we had a chat, apart from our catch up on the weekend. We were just chatting off air.
2 years.
Yeah, it must be 2 years. Yeah, we were just chatting off air about this recent article about the 66 million year old fish fossils from the suspected asteroid impact. Tell us about that. What's your view on that from a paleontologist perspective?
Well, it's an interesting case. I mean, I was a student under Robert Bacher, who was kind of the rogue loner paleontologist who was, largely responsible for changing the brand and the image of dinosaurs back in the 80s and 90s from, these like sluggish, cold-blooded things to these, hot-blooded, family-living, active, dynamic creatures.
Come to think of it, I can see the big image change there now. I that really did happen, didn't it?
That's great.
Yeah, and he wrote this book, Dinosaur Heresies, that I got as a kid when I was way too young to be reading stuff like that, and then he consulted on Jurassic Park. But anyway, the point is that Bacher was he was a crime scene investigator. He was not somebody that was just blowing fossils out of hillsides. He was really looking at the way that he could reconstruct the lives and the landscapes and the ecosystems of these creatures using very nuanced and subtle techniques, the collection of broken teeth that the animals lost while eating, so that he was able to track seasonal feeding patterns, even when the sedimentary record of these creatures would not resolve. Like you get like 100-year or 1,000-year flood, and so you can't really make out in some respects what's really going on in like an annual basis. But he was nonetheless able to find these really nuanced ways of doing that. And he always had an objection to the asteroid impact hypothesis for dinosaur extinction. Not that it didn't happen. I mean, the evidence is very, very strong that it did. And this local site is a really excellent example of that, where you're seeing the molten glass that got forced into the gills of all of these fish by this tsunami created by the asteroid impact in Mexico.
Yeah.
But, he really, he was an advocate of a theory of mass extinctions that has since come to be called the press pulse theory, which is just that, we look for these like silver bullet, these fabulous explanations, something that would look good on television. And of course, the asteroid impact has been, rendered with computer graphics, probably hundreds of times for various documentaries. It's a spectacular event.
Yeah. Would I be right in saying that asteroid impact is what created the Gulf of Mexico? Is that the thought?
The Chicxulub crater. There was already not the Gulf of Mexico per se, because right. That's more the joining of North and South America, and the land bridge created by that. But there is an enormous amount of displaced land in that area. But the thing is that there was also around the same time in India, there was a 2 million year long volcanic eruption.
Wow.
That, and there were the formation of new land bridges that were, leading to the migrations of animals between continents, spreading disease. There were a lot of different things going on at the time. And, Bakker, his critique of this was Luis Alvarez, the Alvarez father-son team that first found the evidence for this impact in a layer of radioactive dirt all around the world. That there's this layer of iridium, which is a radioactive isotope that we only find in meteor impacts and volcanic eruptions. And they found this thing, and he's like, well, of course, this is not a fun place to be 66 million years ago.
Obviously,
but, but like at the same time, we're talking about the extinction of not just the dinosaurs, but of 75% of life on Earth. And if you look at every other mass extinction on the planet, the one that led to the age of dinosaurs, the Permian extinction, which was even more catastrophic and terrible, had to do a lot more with volcanoes and the release of methane gas. And so, I grew up kind of trained to think about things as having more than one cause.
That's really important.
It's not so simple. It doesn't make sense for us as like potent of an image as it is. That it's sort of it's misleading to say that this one event was the sole contributor to this planet-wide catastrophe.
Which is a rather good analogue of life on Earth right now, isn't it? And just on that point, the volcanic activity, I think it's rather important. There's a piece that a listener has texted in just now this morning from National Geographic from last year. Good sort of straight publication, but some good stuff in there. But it also talks about that eruptions plus volcanic eruptions plus the asteroid caused a 1-2 punch. That's what their theory. The volcanism provided the first strike, weakening the climate so much that a meteor, the more deafening blow, was able to spell disaster for Tyrannosaurus rex and its late Cretaceous kin. So I guess that's more likely scenario, more complex scenario.
Yeah, and there's other layers of complexity to this. I mean, there is it's still somewhat controversial, but there's mounting evidence that entire lineages of organisms become kind of specialized to a particular ecological milieu, and then the world changes, and they're not, due to the sort of bias inherent in the way that their genes regulate the development of that organism, they've sort of painted themselves into a corner, and the older and the more specialized a lineage of organisms becomes, the less flexible it is. It's sort of a genetic senescence, an aging of entire clades of creatures. And
very interesting.
That's fascinating.
It's pretty good. I know that you like talking about psychedelics on this show, and I think it's worth mentioning that, the dinosaurs, they may not, the sort of blooming, the literal blooming of flowering plants about halfway through the age of dinosaurs, which then led to a whole suite of new niches, new opportunities for psychedelic substances to emerge as ways of confusing the predators of various types of plants and fungi.
An increase in novelty.
There's a great I think there's some research that suggests that the modern relatives of dinosaurs, birds and crocodiles, lack taste aversion. They lack the ability to taste something and know that it's bad, and then like learn not to eat it. And so that there is we have trapped in amber evidence of psychedelic ergot fungus from the age of dinosaurs, and I think it's kind of interesting to think that that about halfway through the age of dinosaurs there was a smaller but still significant extinction in which creatures like Stegosaurus kind of phased out, around the time of the flowering plants, and that it was the dinosaurs sort of were already in decline through the last half of their reign in terms of species diversity and their ability to adapt to the rapidly changing ecosystem that was sort of catalyzed by the emergence of flowering plants.
Yeah, interesting.
You know, they may have been slowly poisoning themselves for 100 million years.
Well, and this is a topic that's extremely important to us and our own species at the moment, as we're facing, you know, radical changes in our life conditions, in our environment, the Earth systems, and those sorts of things. And our capacity to transit through this period of rapid disruptive change is going to be a direct function of our ability to sense and learn and act and adapt, you know, as a species to these new conditions. Hey.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I gave a talk a couple of years ago at the Global Eclipse Gathering in Oregon, where I compared the emergence of flowering plants and pollinators to the emergence of mobile devices and like social networks and how, you know, we're at this point now where you know, we tend to think of creation and destruction as separate things, but it's really a matter of for whom is it creation and for whom is it destruction? Like, who has the flexibility, not just the resilience, but the adaptability to adjust to these radically very rapidly evolving contexts, you know? And I think that there are a lot of things that have proven to be robust and to be able to like surf the singularity, as it were, and a lot of things in both culturally and biologically that are falling by the wayside. But I do think it's a mistake to think of our age merely in terms of the catastrophic loss of biodiversity that we are causing to the systems. When there are so many new forms of diversity that are springing up in their stead, you know, and I think that there have to be kind of better ways, more nuanced ways of talking about comparing these kinds of diversity.
Yeah. Like,
you know, do we really want, you know, do we want, like, for example, like ecologists, you know, they're not, by and large, conservation ecologists are moving out of this sort of conservative view where we're trying to restore the ecosystems that human beings themselves actually created thousands of years ago. You know, this sort of British parkland fantasy of Eden, you know, a lost romantic nature. And that's just not the case. Like, we've been living in an environment that has been shaped by dynamic interactions between plants and animals and fungi and bacteria and other, you know, microbial organisms for, you know, since the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there's a ton of stuff to unpack from what you've just said. So maybe
we should. I'm also playing because just for our listeners who are hearing you from a long way away, you've also been here in Australia. And you had quite a connection to our good friend Danny Schreiber before he passed away at Starseed Gardens. And I'm playing in the background just a little bit of your piece of music called "Listening to Plants" as you're talking about this that you made here in Byron Bay. It's playing you can't hear it, but playing in the background just a little bit right now. So that connection that you have between, as you're talking about, the various kingdoms and particularly the biome, the gut biome is, of course, Danny Schreiber's later work was particularly focused on that. Can you just speak a little bit towards that connection that those things have with each other, the complexity there?
Definitely. You know, one of the things I loved about Dan was that he was so delighted in his refusal of the idea of himself as a singular thing, you know, that he really made the point in conversation to to assert that he was a plural identity, you know, that he was a collective of all sorts of different creatures living in harmony with one another, that, you know, and that this, I think that there's, you know, when you talk about this movement from the sort of modern notion of the individual into postmodern forms of identity, you know, and this is certainly something that I think catalyzed by the complexity of our lives online. That it's so easy for us to move from one social context to another, and in so doing reflect a completely different identity. That I think the notion of a plural or networked self is really rearing its head these days.
That's true. One of the interesting things about the current paradigm shift that's going on, I'm talking about the sort of, in very general terms, the dominant global paradigm shift from the modern scientific industrial mindset to this relativistic, network-centric, humanistic
orange to green
in spiral dynamics terms. One of the aspects of that is that if we look at the spiral overall, we know that in the collective systems, that is the even-numbered systems in Clare Graves's model, we're talking tribalism, authoritarianism, and the emerging paradigm, they all have very long-term views of time. And on the opposite side of the spiral, in the individualistic systems, and we're talking about hunter-gatherer, about egocentric warlike, and about the modern scientific industrial, it's always a much shorter perspective on time. And so in this process of moving from a short-term outlook to a long-term outlook, the value of the kind of stuff that you've studied, of looking at these ancient fossils and the records and the cycles and change dynamics that are evident over long periods of time, is something that we need to shift our attention to as a global society in particular, in order to cope with the radical, rapid disruptive change that's really on our doorstep right now.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to make, that it's also it's an adaptive strategy at the individual level. I think so much of the reason that I think about this stuff is actually as an antidote to the fear that emerges in confronting these radically disruptive, turbulent periods of history. To be born into an age of this kind of extraordinary change, there's so much of the conversation around what we're living through right now is as though it were completely unprecedented, as though it's a radically unique thing, and I think that part of that emerges from this bias towards this short time frame and a linear storytelling, and also like you talk about the orange meme, this sort of modernist achievement-based kind of a thing where we want to pat ourselves on the back still for being so unique and special.
Yeah.
And the fact of it is that to see what we're living through right now exclusively through that lens is to refuse the opportunities that we have to anchor what's happening now in a much, much deeper frame. And I think, to understand the history of evolution and of, mass extinctions and mass evolutionary adaptive irradiations and these enormous movements and this, this symphony of Earth history is really helpful, at least for me, as a way of sort of normalizing this kind of change. Just saying, there are strategies that life has come up with for handling periods of Earth history like this, that we don't have to derive our tools or our techniques for navigating this kind of turbulence from first principles. We can really look at, the way that bacteria handled the oxygen catastrophe 2 billion years ago for some insights, for example, into, how to deal with pollution and how to, this crisis of industrial byproducts and plastic islands.
Absolutely.
We've got ancestors that we can solicit for this. We have elders that we can turn to beyond the human world.
For sure.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans.
Welcome back to Future Sense, and we're talking to Michael Garfield, futurist and paleontologist and social media expert at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. Michael, to continue our discussion about these long cycles of time and how we can learn from the past to help create and smooth our transition into the future. You were talking during the break there about storytelling and how we tell stories and this fascination we seem to have for mass extinction. So talk some more about that.
We're talking, as we said, to Michael Garfield. We're back online. Michael, yeah, you heard that question about evolutionary narratives, yeah?
Yes. Yeah, I think, the whole thing is that we do want stories. We're very
we're story-making creatures, aren't we? Yeah, we are.
Yeah, but I think it's also, the first 100 years of evolutionary science, we were not really aware of the fact that we were telling a story. We've had to adjust to the the sort of postmodern philosophical turn and accept that it's not just that when we speak, that it's not just about the object of our sentence, but the subject and the verb also. Who is making the claim? How did we come to this understanding? And this is a really important thing to consider when we reflect about the ways that the evolutionary thinking has been so painfully, horribly abused over the decades by laissez-faire capitalism, by genocidal dictators. So I think that's part of it. That's part of I think the reason it's important to regard all of these stories as stories.
And because the storytelling process is such a part of the communal layers in the spiral of consciousness. And here in Australia, in the last couple of years, I remember seeing an amazing report in the media of an astronomical event, which was something to do with supernova, I think. Which had been recorded in Aboriginal oral history, and this happened 30,000 years ago, and the story of that particular bright light in the sky was still being told to the present day in that local culture, that gave rise to this story. And that's just incredible to think that like an important event like that could be carried down for 30,000 years through oral storytelling.
Definitely. The fantasy author Neil Gaiman.
Oh yes.
He gave us at the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco, which is an organization devoted to this kind of long-term, big picture thinking, to helping us situate ourselves in a complex time, where we're thinking about the rapid timescales of fashion and social media, and the slower timescales of government and civic infrastructure, and then the even longer timescales of cultural evolution and natural cycles. And Neil Gaiman said in his talk, he said, if you really want to pass information down through the centuries, for example, if you want to ensure that people don't go digging in your nuclear waste disposal site, that the best thing that you can do is start a religion. Because the facts, the facts don't, the way that we understand and contextualize the words change their meaning over time, but taboos are remarkably consistent, remarkably stable. So that's kind of an aside, but
I think very good one.
It's good for us to think, if I can get kind of meta about it, it's good for us to investigate, as evolving creatures ourselves, that as creatures that understand.
Oh my goodness!
Understand something. He's gone again. There he is.
There you go. Yeah, bad. We lost you for a second. For a second, but keep talking.
As creatures who understand.
These are this is the Space Monkey challenge of the Transoceanic Live Radio call. But
I think
for writing this with us.
Don't worry, we have this amazing national broadband network here. I think we're rated about 52nd.
52nd in the world, and dropping daily.
We're sliding. Please continue.
I mean, it's great.
Yeah.
It's great, Michael, too, because I think you're talking. You refer to a term which I think is really good. You talk about cumulative culture. I never really thought about that humans have this cumulative culture, which other animals don't seem to actually have. And this is what you're talking about. This accumulation really triggered this notion of me. Well, it's not again, of course, it's not a linear thing. It's an expanding, ever complexifying process of culture that we're involved in. This accumulation of culture. Can you speak a little bit further about that? That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, I think, like I was saying a moment ago, maybe it was lost over the signal glitch, but we are.
Yeah, we're losing.
Yes, in which evolution, sort of leaves us at the station of our human nature, and here we are, and we're observing this from the outside, objectively.
Yes.
But that's the very tools that we use to explore our world and our human nature are themselves the products of evolution, and that that stories are selected for in the same way that organisms are selected for. And the whole thing about cumulative culture, which is this notion that we externalize our knowledge in books and other forms of media, and so that we can pass them down in ways that transcend the limitations of our individual bodies and even our individual cultural modes. That this is, I think, evidence that the human social superorganism is sort of now the main player. That at the moment that the origin of human not just human civilization, but human culture, the tribal moment that we came together and we realized that we could teach each other and that we could pass down wisdom, from our grandparents to our grandchildren, that this represented a moment very much like the origin of the cell, when these molecules were sort of bound together inside of a membrane. And so, the origins of life researchers talk about this proto-cell in which, there was like a moment that things were almost a cell, but not quite. And that, the paleoanthropological researchers propose that there might be a social protocell, like a moment that right before the tinder lit on human society, that there were all of these sort of like loose primate troops that were, they were learning from one another, but that they weren't like compressing their knowledge into forms that could endure down through generations in any kind of reasonable way that then conferred a survival benefit to the entire community. And so, that basically what makes us unique, if anything, what makes us unique as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is simply that our cultural traditions and our tools are now a part of what it means to be human, and they always have been. And so, this notion that, again, to this thing of looking for precedents in the past, to understand what we're living through now, that when people talk about the singularity, this moment that the machines sort of supersede us and that we're no longer in control of our evolutionary story. It's like, no, the singularity happened 500,000 years ago.
That's great.
I think it was even longer ago than that. Actually, I often say that the singularity has already happened. It's just human consciousness that's growing into trying to comprehend what happened. In this transition from the modern scientific industrial to the next paradigm, we're leaving behind the individual way of being human, and we're also leaving behind our sort of materialistic, disconnected from nature worldview. And I think those are two really important aspects which will change and are changing, and that are leading us into this different perspective that you're painting very beautifully here. The first one being that we are not part of nature, and this has been the commonly held belief during the last old paradigm
since the Enlightenment, certainly.
And that's changing, and it's most immediately changing to reconnect with Earth as our most immediate representation of Mother Nature herself, but also nature extends into the cosmos and perhaps even into other universes. So nature is infinite, and reconnecting with that and thinking differently as part of that instead of thinking as if we're separate from that is key to this. I think what you've just said there is a really great example of how our thinking can change to embrace that and start to see ourselves as being a participant in this process of unfolding cycles, and also in a two-way communication with the rest of nature, right? It's not a one-way discussion. It's not just us observing. It's us actually being embedded in and learning from that also.
And finding communication pathways too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of the story itself, I think, as the evolutionary object or process that like you talk about with value memes, that these are things that emerge within a particular container, a social context of tools and beliefs and traditions. And, I think, that to the extent that we're actually just sort of being operated on by our stories, I think it's really actually beautiful. Like since the 1960s, when Lynn Margulis introduced the idea that complex life actually emerged out of intimate collaborations between simpler forms of life, and that at first was very controversial, and now it's accepted. And so I think, it's in a kind of weird meta way. I really enjoy watching the stories and the ways that these stories act upon us as changing to suit the environment that their changes to us have created. Because it's like this, there's a ratcheting effect where as society becomes more complex, it requires of us more complex ways of thinking, interacting, communicating about these things. And then that new complexity just creates more complexity.
It does. It's a two-way street. We talk about this double helix model of Graves, and one is the complexity of life conditions and the other is the adaptive nature of human consciousness. And when life conditions become more complex, human consciousness adapts to operate in more complex ways. And then we create more complexity ourselves in our own life conditions. So it's a spiraling, interactive process.
Exciting. You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. 10:21 here on Future Sense at 11 o'clock, coming up pregnancy, birth and beyond, as is true every Monday. And Michael Garfield, we've been talking to today, paleontologist and futurist from Santa Fe, he lives in Santa Fe, originally from Austin, Texas, and also host and producer of Future Fossils podcast. So we're talking about all sorts of things, and it's a very rich conversation, much to talk about, much to think about. We're going to sort of bring it to a pretty common theme, and that is the theme of time itself.
Right now,
here we are. Hello, good day.
And Michael, you suggested maybe turning the tables here and asking me some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I am really curious about, given the amount of time that you've spent on spiral dynamics and more generally on human developmental psychology, is the way that time is understood differently by all of these different layers. And this is something I'd love to get into like much more detail with you on my own show when we get that together. But I'm really curious how you think that living online, living in a planetary culture, is changing the way that we understand the ideas or the experience of past, present, and future.
Yeah, sure. It might be useful just for me to step through the different worldviews, the layers of consciousness, maybe starting at Blue or 4, which was the absolutistic, authoritarian worldview that emerged around or following the agricultural revolution. And that was really the emergence of cause and effect thinking. So it was a time when we moved out of what's known as the pre-rational zone, where our behavior, our being was really dominated by urges and instincts and very much in the moment, in the present. And the frontal lobe development was completed, and we developed this capacity to think about what we were doing, think about concepts, and the rational mind sort of became dominant in our state of being, and that's where we saw the emergence of this cause and effect thinking, where we could sort of think in a very linear way, but we could think about, okay, if I do this now, then something's going to change in the future, or if I don't do this now, something's going to change in the future. So that was very much a product of that Blue 4th layer consciousness, and then from there moving back to the individual side of the spiral with the scientific industrial revolutions, the Enlightenment, the emergence of this modern worldview, modern perspective on being human. Time became a precious resource, and we were still kind of locked in this linear concept of time, but we had multiple choices in terms of the future and what we did with our time. And Graves called this particular layer of consciousness multiplistic for that reason, because it broke out of linear thinking, and all of a sudden there were possibilities in the future, whereas previously the future was absolutely linear, and it was like if this then that. But now in the modern era, we have this multiplistic view, which gives us options. And if I do this way now, then that's going to be the future. And if I do this other way now, then something else is going to be the future. So we broke out into multiplicity. And what's happening now is we're transitioning from that into the next way of being human, which is this relativistic way, where it's very network-centric. We're very focused on the human experience, human values, and with each of these steps forward in an evolutionary sense, our senses are literally expanding. So we have, a deeper capacity to access information in all the different dimensions of our being. And so probably the best example of relativistic thinking in relation to time is, of course, Einstein's theory of relativity, where he figured out that, okay, if we go traveling through space, then that person who's traveling through space is going to experience time differently than me here. And so we're branching out into, what is this network, still on a level, like a flat playing field. So there's still not a lot of dimensional depth there. But this idea that someone else can be experiencing time different than I am, and it's this connecting of the dots between different human experiences, which is blossoming at this time in history, and we're able to think about, for example, other religious beliefs as being somehow connected to our religious beliefs and having some similarity, similar underlying concepts, and maybe it's just the same thing, but it's being experienced from a different human perspective. And we also have this capacity to experience internally what it's like to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and conceptualize their different perspective on the world. So that's how I see time changing most immediately.
So do you think then that that the idea of a future in a networked society is really even useful? I mean, I know that you guys talk about it. You quote the excellent William Gibson quote that the future is already here. It's just distributed unevenly.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about Silicon Valley people talking about the future, like the idea that there is a singular future or that it's arriving at the same time for everyone seems a bit like stayed.
It's very old school. It's very old school. And I mean, the simple fact is, because humanity is spread across this spectrum of consciousness, we're not all at the same place. We're not all experiencing reality in the same way through the same worldview. And that's been a very broadly accepted perspective in the past. But, fundamentally, when we start talking about human consciousness and human nature, we're all the same. We're all going to respond the same to various those things. But now we're teasing that out, and this is only really coming, due to developmental psychology, which itself is really poking into second-tier consciousness. It's this capacity to start to perceive different dimensions of consciousness, and that's that the fullness of understanding of that is not really evident in this most immediate paradigm shift from modern to postmodern or relativistic. But what we can do is we can look at these kinds of models, and we can see the diversity in them. So rather than seeing the multidimensionality at layer 6 or green relativistic, we're seeing the diversity. So we can get this idea, just as Einstein did, that okay, there's diversity of experience here. It's not just all the one experience. Everybody has their own cosmic address, as Ken Wilber would say, and they perceive reality from that address. And so to answer your question, yes, there are multiple nows, not just multiple futures or pasts. There are multiple nows, and everybody is experiencing their own now in a different way through their own window of consciousness. And there are, of course, even in the sort of modern scientific industrial thinking, there are multiple possible futures. But now we can start to ponder the fact that, okay, if everybody on the planet is experiencing now in a different way, then there's got to be multiple actual futures, for taking that same perspective on things.
It's fascinating, Joe.
Isn't that kind of a problem, given your, this? I mean, it seems like it's kind of important that we sort of agree on a direction, don't you think? Or is that hopelessly naive?
We can agree if we are coming from the same value system, with the same worldview, because we have that commonality of perspective of worldview. We're not going to get absolute agreement between different worldviews, because the basic framework for making sense of reality is fundamentally different. We can come to an understanding that where we understand each other, and particularly if we have a fuller awareness of the differences in worldviews or value systems. But this idea that we all need to agree is an extremely strong theme in the emerging paradigm. It's everywhere. I mean, if even to the point of it starting to displace science, and there have been scientific papers written. I discovered one the other day written about this very subject. That the issue of consensus is creeping into science and being given a status in the same way that material evidence would have been given status 10 or 20 years ago.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and that is an issue. It's a confounding issue for science. I mean, it's a huge issue, and perhaps most prominent in the global warming discussion, where people roll out this statistic of 94% of scientists agree, right? Which is not that's not data. It's not hard data. It's social science, not hard science. So, but it's a very important theme, and it's good that you've touched on it, because people are feeling this, and it's part of the dynamic is we're moving from an individual way of being human to a communal way of being human, and every communal way now and in the past has been all about conforming and learning how to be together. How do we cope together in the face of all this change? Well, the first thing is we've got to agree at some level. So yes, it's a very important issue.
Amazing. You talk, Michael, quoting you here about the powerful new paradigm in evolution emerging from the interference pattern. And I know it's not entirely the same thing, but it occurred to me as Steve was talking there that your perspective on that interference pattern of research in mathematics, evolutionary biology, computer science, developmental psychology, paleoanthropology, and the origins of life. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because that seems to be, to me anyway, some part of the equation that we're talking about here, that actually the interference pattern itself is much stronger than any direct or obvious one direction that we can go in.
Well, yeah, much like Steve was just saying, it's kind of, I guess, foolish for us to think that we're all going, if we start to think of the social body, and again, I really want to lean on this argument that we're like, for as long as we've been humans, I think that the emerging myth here is that we have, the emerging network sort of green myth is that we have always been collective and tribal and networked. And so, to look at it in that way, to look at the history of humanity to not be the history so much of individuals, but as the history of communities and communities that extend beyond our current understanding of human. That we have to, in order to live in a networked civilization, that we have to adopt adaptive stories that include, technology and the what we have called nature,
yes,
as not other than, that we've sort of, we've cloistered ourselves into these membranes. And so at any rate, to see it in this way, to open the boundaries of our humanity, to participate in and include in ourselves, what Darwin called the tangled bank of symbiotic evolutionary relationships, not just with other living creatures, but with the geology and the technology of this planet, then the interference pattern is, you can see these dynamics playing within a complex cultural ecology of different minds at different points in their development, holding different cultural understandings and linguistic framings as sort of tissues or muscle systems within a vast planetary organism. And so you start looking at like the ways that people on opposite sides of the political aisle are working together in spite of their apparent conflict. For example, like a bicep and a or the muscles of your legs. Like if one side of your leg were to win the argument, then you'd fall over.
That's true.
You need two wings to fly, so to speak.
Right. So the question of how the world's disclosed by all of these different, is sometimes arguing methods and perspectives, what emerges at their intersection. And I think, to me, what I see, like one of the kind of major things that I see in that is that we are, like I was saying earlier, that we are storytelling creatures as an adaptive strategy to living together, which is itself an adaptive strategy to surviving in a complex and chaotic universe. And so the way that we see things, there's like a Mobius strip here, where if you tug on your understanding of the natural world.
He's disappeared again. If you can hear us, Michael, we're trying to get you back.
Yeah, reconnecting.
We're on Skype here, folks, and talking to Michael Garfield in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Last few minutes of this. Are you there?
I think we got you back again, yeah?
You're back.
Yeah.
We lost you for a second there, yeah.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense here on Bay FM. 10:38 here on Bay FM on Future Sense, and we've got Michael back for the last few minutes. We've got about 5 more minutes, Michael. Let's see if we can finish that thought.
Here we are, and there's nothing more important at this time when we're going through this global paradigm shift as connection and the need for connection, and that's being demonstrated to us as the connection keeps dropping out during our call here. But
and thanks for your text, folks. Intriguing show, says Melody. Thanks very much. So let's finish that. You were talking about the interference pattern. I don't know exactly where we lost you, but perhaps you can pick it up.
Oh gosh, well, I think the bottom. I think what it all boils down to is that looking at all of these different fields, trying to find a way to bring them together into a single understanding. What it brings me to is that if you push far enough in your inquiry into what we think of as the natural world, then you end up having to address the issue of psychology and the who is asking the question. But if you push far enough into a study of the mind and the way that we come up with models of our world, then you end up with questions about how it is that we came to this point, the context, the evolutionary environment that we have adapted to. And so, really, I think that the new paradigm I see emerging in the evolutionary sciences is beyond this sort of, the evolutionary psychology thing, and into, not just, oh, this is how men and women are, and this is why, social media has learned, how they've figured out how to like capitalize on your attention and all this stuff. It's a step further. It's about, the limits of the knowable and our relationship to mystery, like what it is to be, what it is to call something random, or to say it's not. It's that it has a pattern to it. And this all sounds very vague.
but I think what you're saying is very important, because it's about understanding our own limitations, and by knowing what we can't know, or more specifically what we don't know, then it provides us an opportunity to expand, our ways of knowing, I think, and just to have deeper conversations around that. But, when the worst place that we can be is thinking that we know everything, and, there's a bit of that going on around the world at the moment, where people are totally convinced they know it, all the sciences, yes. And there's no questions to be asked. I mean, that's the most dangerous place that we can be from an evolutionary adaptation kind of perspective, right?
Yeah, and the second most dangerous place is thinking that we can know everything.
Yes.
Which is willful ignorance. I mean, we've known from Gödel's and completeness theorems for like a century that's not what we're doing here.
Yeah, exactly.
There was another.
Go ahead.
More research recently on unsolvable mathematical problems. And I think that there's something about it changes the flavor of discovery and scientific inquiry when we accept that we're not going to figure it all out.
Yeah.
And that even if we invent a machine that can figure out things that we can't understand, that we're back to kind of a theological question, like, how do we know that we can trust what the machine is telling us?
Yeah.
Like how would we even recognize if this planet is a single giant intelligent superorganism? If Google like became conscious, how could we even recognize it?
Yeah.
And that really, that kind of that's the dog barking next door. I think it's this question of our relationship to the transcendence, I think, is really where we are ultimately. And I think that that in another few decades that we're going to have a very different attitude in the sciences and in the humanities with respect to transcendental mystery and what is and is not possible with the human project. And I think that kind of humbling could not come couldn't come soon enough.
Yeah. And another big issue here too is this idea that we're all alone here, and we are the only example of consciousness that's evolving, and there's no one else out there. And, I mean, that's obviously something that's going to shift in the future. And I think it's a big limitation on human nature, to be still in this place where we think that we're the only consciousness that exists in the entire universe. And therefore, we've got to figure it all out ourselves.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then of course, that means that everything that we see is just like ripe for our exploitation, which is nonsense. So like, I would love to see the end of the 21st century be one in which we have a planetary congress where humans are represented and dolphins are represented and the wood wide web of mycorrhizal relationships has a voice,
Yeah.
And I don't know what it takes for us to get there, but I think it starts with us accepting that, all of our models are themselves just sophisticated stories that have adapted to a particular psychological and social context.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We have to wind up soon.
That's great.
Short on time.
Yeah, that's great, Michael. That's a lovely little summary there. Really like that.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of throw in at the end here. Looking at the time spans in our past, of the evolution of worldviews and these major transformations that happen, and we move to a new layer of consciousness, or add a new layer of consciousness. I should say. The time spans of those various paradigms getting shorter and shorter and shorter imply that what we're moving into now, this sixth layer, the relativistic way of being human, is most likely going to be the shortest lived paradigm so far. And it may even be, in terms of the dominance of that particular way of being human at a global level, it may only last a couple of decades. And then, of course, immediately following that, we've got this massive quantum leap in human consciousness, which has shown up in the research, and which a few pathfinders, have completed already here in real life. And so from that perspective, what we're moving into right now is really the last blast of the rational mind's dominance of our human nature. And it's inevitably going to lead to an overload, a place where there's just so much information available to us that we can't compute and make sense of it with the rational mind, which is really the evolutionary tension, which is going to flick us into this quantum leap that's coming very, very soon, actually.
Although, of course, the notion of linear time here is itself suspect.
Yeah. Well, it's also collapsing. Exactly. Yes, I agree.
Michael Garfield, we'll have to leave it there, and I suspect we'll probably come back and talk to you another time in the future. Paleontologist, Futurist, and host and producer of Future Fossils podcast. I was just looking through my notes again here, and he's currently also, and he's got a day job, communication strategist for the Santa Fe Institute, which we didn't talk about, but it is the world's preeminent complex systems science research organisation. Thanks so much, Michael, for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a wonderfully rich conversation, mate. Thank you so much.
We'll talk to you again.
Thank you both. Thanks for putting up with the line issues.
Yeah, no worries.
No worries.
Talk to you soon.
Talk to you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Cheers.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans. Last few minutes here of Future Sense for this morning. It's 10:49 here with Steve McDonald, Nick Jeans, and our special guest before, Michael Garfield. I thought that was fascinating and opens up more questions than we answered, and hopefully those of you who are interested in this stuff got something from that. Please, and thanks for all your texts. We've mentioned quite a number of them. There's a few texts here we won't get to this morning, but appreciate all those texts. 0437341119 at any time. You can also text us right now if you want to. A couple of other things we want to just mention before we leave this morning. Steve, you've got a bit of information there, economic information, planetary economics. Ooh.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that something on our radar is economic disruption next month. That's May. And this is showing up particularly in Martin Armstrong's algorithm as a liquidity crisis. And there are many, many different indicators that have cropped up over the last months and years that this might be on the cards. And I had a chat over the weekend to my futurist friend Benjamin Butler, who comes from a finance background, and he was also in line with this prediction and thinking that we're up for a liquidity crisis. And there've been a few issues contributing to it. Rather, one of them is the changes in the quantitative easing situation, where they kind of dropped that strategy. Problems with government bonds, not just in the US but internationally as well. And Benjamin was telling me that the German government is now issuing bonds that require the acquirer of the bond to pay the government rather than getting paid interest on the bond, which is a bit of a mind flip. But that's happening, and there have been numerous strategic issues that have arisen for investors over the last year or more, where people have been shifting their money out of things like government bonds and into different investments, and as part of that, money has been getting locked up. One specific example is in Turkey, where the government there said people who had money invested in Turkey couldn't have access to it. And so that's an issue, and it's one of many issues. Again, complex situation, multiple issues coming together to create interference patterns, as you were talking about before, Nick. And the outcome looks like it may well be a major liquidity crisis during May, meaning simply that people can't get access to their money when they want it. And we're talking about large-scale investment specifically. So that's something to keep in mind. And parallel to all of that developing, the crypto market has woken up again. So it's been a long hibernation over winter, which has lasted, a year or more for the crypto market, where we had this massive slide last year, which really bottomed out in December. And then we've had a slow awakening over the last month or so, and it's starting to fire up now, which is very interesting. And it's going to be wonderful and amazing to watch the interaction between the mainstream market situation and the crypto market situation, and what unfolds in May and how they play off against each other.
Very interesting. A couple of other things that have been on our radar, and just to mention quickly that John Pilger the great Australian/British journalist who's gone up against forces of governments, including our own, over many, many years as a documentary filmmaker and a journalist. John Pilger is in Byron, presented by the Nagara Institute on Wednesday night. You're going, Steve, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm going to go. Should be very interesting.
And there may be some tickets left, a few tickets. You can go to the Nagara Institute, NGARA website for those tickets. We've also been watching a little bit about 5G. I've had, on my other show on North Coast Positive on Fridays, I've talked about with some local representatives who are up against 5G locally. But we've been having a bit of a look at that, and there is some movement around 5G in the world. The Belgian government has just announced that Brussels is halting its 5G plans due to health effects. The statement was made by Celine Vermoldt, the Minister of the government of Brussels capital region, responsible for housing, quality of life, environment and energy and the like. And they are halting their 5G rollout in that country to have a look at the health effect. Meanwhile, I think it's Korea, which is going the other direction.
It looks like South Korea is going to be the first large-scale rollout. So unfortunately, they look like being the guinea pigs. So we'll actually start to see some. If there is going to be any health impact, we'll start to see that quite possibly there.
And we came across. You came across, and I'm familiar with this chap, Sacha Stone, who I think still lives in Bali. He's actually just put out very recently, about 2 weeks ago, a YouTube video. It's called 5G Apocalypse, the Extinction Event. It's already had nearly 250,000 views. You might want to check that out. It's on YouTube. The 5G Apocalypse, the Extinction Event. It's a 1.5 hour doco or so. It's quite long. I've only watched a little bit of it so far.
I haven't watched it at all, and I just want to make the point that we're not necessarily endorsing anything that's in this video. So we're not saying that it's good or bad or real or unreal. But
if you are concerned,
if you're interested.
yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for your text. And someone's just written, "Hi Nick and Steve, bring it on. Missed all but the last few lines of that interview, so I hope I get to listen to it later on. Looking forward to more disruption and change." And you can, of course, check out all of our shows, which are edited up with all the sponsorships and other stuff and music edited out. And that podcast on Future Sense Show. You can go to our Twitter account and check out that.
And futuresense.it is the website with all the links to the different places you can get the podcast.
Very good. That's it for the show today. Thanks for joining us here, and we will be back, of course, next Monday morning here on Bay FM from 9 to 11 a.m. Thanks, Steve.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.